In the smoky backroom of the Sands Hotel, July 18, 1963, Dean Martin cracked a joke that hit Elvis Presley harder than a punch. Everyone expected Elvis to brush it off with a grin. But instead, he laughed too loudly because what he said next didn't just stun Dean. It stopped the entire Rat Pack dead in their tracks. Las Vegas glowed like a jewel dropped onto the desert. And on July 18, 1963, the Sands Hotel shined brightest of all. Its golden lights cut through the evening haze, pulling in tourists, high rollers, and entertainers like a magnet. Inside the famous Copa room, a different kind of electricity filled the air, smooth, smoky, and laced with the confidence of men who ruled the Vegas nightlife. Frank Sinatra sat comfortably with a drink that barely moved in his hand. Sammy Davis Jr. tapped a quiet rhythm against the table. Dean Martin, relaxed and loose, held court with his usual half-smile and half-sip swagger. Everything felt effortless to them. This room belonged to the Rat Pack and they knew it. But tonight someone else stepped in. Elvis Presley walked in quietly, slipping past a red curtain with Colonel Parker at his side. Behind them, backup singer Millie Kirkland tried to stay invisible among the showgirls and comedians drifting through the room. Elvis wasn't wearing a glittering stage outfit or anything loud. Just a crisp shirt, dark jacket, and the kind of look a young man wears when he's unsure if he's welcome. The room shifted almost unnoticeably when he entered. A few heads turned. A few whispers followed. Even legends can get nervous when surrounded by other legends. Cigarette smoke drifted upward like thin ghosts. Laughter echoed from one corner. A glass clinked sharply as a waiter passed. Elvis inhaled deeply, trying to settle himself. He respected these men, their charm, their talent, their presence. But he also knew he didn't quite belong here. Not fully, not yet. Dean Martin caught sight of him and waved him over, voice as velvet. "Hey kid, get over here. Don't be shy." His tone wasn't mean, but it carried weight. The weight of someone who owned the room. Elvis stepped closer. Frank nodded politely. Sammy flashed a warm grin. Dean leaned in, smelling faintly of bourbon and cologne, and dropped his voice low enough for only Elvis to hear. "Whatever he," whispered, hit fast, hard, like a spark landing in dry grass. Elvis froze. He smiled on the surface, but his eyes flicked downward for half a second, just long enough for Millie to notice. She shifted her weight uneasily. Colonel Parker raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to intervene or let Elvis handle it alone. The room kept moving, but the moment around Elvis tightened like a rope. Someone cracked a joke in the back. A showgirl laughed too loudly. A spotlight flickered. The piano player ran a finger across the keys without pressing down. Every small sound felt sharper. Elvis swallowed. His hands stayed at his sides, steady, but tense. He refused to show discomfort. Not here, not in front of men he admired. But deep down, a single question hit him hard. Why did that bother me so much? Who hasn't walked into a room and suddenly felt judged without warning? And what do you do when someone challenges your worth in front of people whose approval you never wanted to lose? Elvis forced a small smile, but Dean's remark lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. Elvis didn't respond. He didn't trust his voice yet. The silence stretched tight and awkward. Frank glanced over, sensing tension. Sammy raised one eyebrow. Even a few showgirls paused their chatter, sensing a shift they couldn't name. Elvis stood still. Dean waited, and the whole room felt like it was holding its breath. Then Dean grinned wider, leaning back as if he tossed out a harmless joke. But Elvis knew better. Something in the air changed. A spark, a challenge, a test, and Elvis felt it burning. Elvis froze. Dean Martin swirled the ice in his glass, watching Elvis with that half-smirk people used when they wanted to look calm, but still keep the upper hand. The room's buzz softened just a little, like everyone sensed something had shifted. Elvis didn't move. He just stood there trying to pretend Dean's earlier whisper hadn't hit him harder than he expected. Dean leaned forward again, eyes sharp. "Show business ain't a fairy tale. Kid," he said lightly, tapping the side of his glass. "Let's see if the king can croon without the glitter." A few people chuckled, but not in a cruel way, more out of habit because Dean Martin was the kind of man you automatically laughed with. But this laugh didn't land right, felt pointed. A test disguised as a joke. Frank Sinatra's expression tightened. He knew Dean better than anyone in the room. Dean didn't challenge often, but when he did, it meant something. Sammy Davis Jr. leaned forward in his chair, chin resting on his hand, eyes locked on Elvis. He knew what pressure looked like, and he saw it now. Elvis didn't flinch outwardly, but his fingers tapped against the buckle of his belt. A little rhythm, too fast, too controlled. It was something he did only when he felt his nerves firing up. Millie noticed it right away. She'd seen that tapping before shows, before interviews, before moments that mattered too much. Elvis exhaled through his nose, trying to stay cool. He forced a short laugh. Came out too sharp, too quick. The kind of laugh you give when you're trying to act unbothered. But the moment cuts anyway. A few heads turned. A waiter paused mid-step. Dean raised an eyebrow, amused. He knew that laugh wasn't real. Relax. Just want to see if the king can swim without the crown, he added, shrugging casually. But there was nothing casual about his tone. Was Dean teasing him or truly testing him? And how often are we pushed hardest by the people we admire most? People who don't realize their words can bruise. The room waited for Elvis to do something. Anything. Back down. Laugh harder. Wave Dean off. Let it go. But Elvis didn't do any of that. He straightened slowly, shoulders pulling back just an inch. That was all, just an inch. But it shifted everything. His eyes changed too, clearing like fog lifting from a windshield. It wasn't anger. It wasn't ego. It was something quieter and stronger. A decision. Colonel Parker noticed it immediately. His hand, already near his cigar, stopped mid-motion. This wasn't what he wanted. He knew what Elvis looked like right before he stepped into a moment he couldn't step out of. Dean watched him carefully, almost impressed. Elvis took one step forward, then another. He didn't rush, didn't smile, didn't blink too much. The whole room followed every movement like a slow-motion scene in a movie. He stood in front of Dean close enough that Dean's smirk softened just a little. Elvis looked him right in the eyes. "All right, Dean," he said quietly, voice steady and low. He paused. The room leaned in. "Your move." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it landed harder than anything he could have shouted. Sam Unk's lips parted. Frank lowered his drink. Millie covered her mouth with her hand. Colonel Parker whispered something under his breath. Dean Martin blinked once. Then again the room went completely still. Elvis had accepted the challenge, and there was no turning back now. Dean Martin didn't move at first. Elvis's quiet challenge hung in the smoky air like a dare wrapped in velvet. A few seconds passed, long enough to make every person in the room shift uneasily in their seat. Even the air felt heavier, as if the Sands Hotel itself wanted to see what would happen next. Then Dean lifted his chin and snapped his fingers once. Sharp, cold, confident. The house pianist, a thin man named Eddie Hudson, looked up from his drink and straightened. Everyone knew that snap. It meant showtime. Eddie slid onto the bench, fingers hovering. He glanced at Dean for direction. Dean pointed at him with two fingers and made a small circle in the air. The pianist nodded. He knew exactly what Dean wanted. The first person to understand what was happening was Frank Sinatra. His brow lowered slightly. "He's not going to make him do that," Frank muttered under his breath. Sammy Davis Jr. leaned back, eyes wide. "Oh, he is." Millie Kirkland had a bad feeling. She stepped a little closer to Elvis, hoping he would catch her worried look. But Elvis's attention was locked on Dean now, focused, steady, almost too calm. The room changed in seconds. Moments ago, it had been warm and playful, full of laughter and clinking glasses. Now it felt like a small arena, each person circling around two figures, the king and the cool. Dean set his drink down slowly, deliberately. Then he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see the king handle a real tune." There it was, the challenge. Clear, public, undeniable. Dean wasn't asking Elvis to sing his hits. He wasn't asking for a duet. He wanted Elvis to sing Dean's signature song. Something smooth, classic, and built for a crooner. Not a rock and roll phenomenon, a test, a trap, or both. He opened his mouth to interfere, but Frank Sinatra gave him a quick look. One that said, "Don't let the boy decide." Millie whispered, "Elvis, you don't have to do this." But Elvis didn't move, didn't blink, didn't look away. There was something in his stance that made people stop doubting him, even before he proved anything. Eddie hit the first chord. A soft, elegant line from Dean Martin's catalog. Everyone in the room recognized it instantly. A few gasps escaped from the back. Showgirls covered their mouths. A comedian near the bar whispered, "Oh man, he's not going to be able to do that song." It wasn't the melody that made people nervous. It was the ownership. The song belonged to Dean, and everyone knew it. Elvis didn't step backward, didn't shake his head, didn't try to stop the pianist. He stood perfectly still as the music floated through the air, smooth and challenging, like a velvet rope stretched across the room. Have you ever felt everyone watching you, waiting for you to slip? And did you ever realize that sometimes stepping forward is safer than stepping back? Elvis finally took one step, just one. It made the entire circle tighten around him. Chairs slid quietly. People leaned in. Even the ceiling lights seemed to dim, focusing the room's attention. Elvis walked toward the pianist, slow and deliberate. Eddie swallowed hard, unsure if he should keep playing. Elvis gave him a tiny nod, barely noticeable, but enough. The pianist continued. Dean leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, giving Elvis a look half amusement, half challenge. "Go ahead, son. Floor's yours." Elvis didn't pick up a microphone. He didn't need one. The room was small and the silence was big. He looked at Dean, then the piano, then the small crowd circling him like a ring of flickering candles. Colonel Parker held his breath. Frank stared. Sammy grinned nervously. Millie whispered, "Please, Elvis, just walk away." But he didn't. He stood tall, hands relaxed at his sides. The opening notes wrapped around him. And just as the chord reached its peak, Elvis opened his mouth. And the room's parody. This wasn't a joke. Elvis was taking Dean's song seriously. Dean didn't expect that. He sat up straighter, glass lowering slowly in his hand. Frank Sinatra stopped breathing for a moment. Sammy Davis Jr. whispered, "Well, I'll be under his breath." Elvis didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes on the floor for the first few lines, letting his voice settle. The softness wasn't weakness. It was intention. He was shaping the song, shaping the room, shaping the energy. Then something shifted. He raised his head 1 inch, then another, and when his eyes finally lifted, the entire room straightened its spine. He leaned in. He breathed steady. He owned the silence. Short bursts of power slipped through the melody. Not overpowering, not flashy, but heartfelt. He wasn't trying to sound like Dean. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to tell the truth of the song, as if the words had lived inside him the whole time. The room stilled completely. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like frozen ribbons. A showgirl stopped mid-sip. The bartender set down a glass without finishing the polish. Even Colonel Parker's worry softened into confusion. This wasn't the king doing a trick. This was the man singing from the center of who he was. Eddie followed him instinctively, adding a gospel softness to the chords without meaning to. Elvis rode the change, adjusting his voice with the ease of water falling into a riverbed. Dean blinked twice. Frank leaned forward. Sammy mouthed, "Listen to this. Listen to this." The turning point hit halfway through the song. Elvis lifted one hand. Not high, just enough to shape the air, and his voice deepened. Richer, rounder, more emotional. He took a classic Vegas crooner line and poured unexpected warmth into it. The kind of warmth that silenced arguments and softened pride. People stopped mid-breath. They had never heard the song like this. He added a tiny gospel bend at the end of a long note. A delicate slide, heartfelt and vulnerable. A risk, a choice. It wasn't mockery. It was mastery. Dean's smirk faded for the first time that night. His jaw shifted. His eyes narrowed, not out of anger, but out of shock. The kind of shock a seasoned performer feels when he realizes someone else has just done something he didn't see coming. Frank whispered, "Kid's got guts." Sammy whispered back, "He's not trying to beat Dean. He's trying to show him something." Elvis stepped forward into the light. The piano softened. His voice warmed, then chilled, then warmed again. He was sculpting the room's emotions with each word. He wasn't proving himself. He was revealing himself. People felt it. The shift, the heart, the honesty. Even Millie, hands pressed to her chest, whispered, "This is the Elvis they don't see." The song approached its ending. Elvis slowed, held the final phrase longer than expected. Let the silence gather around it like a curtain closing. Then he did something no one expected. He looked directly at Dean Martin, clear, calm, steady, and delivered one clean final line. Just 6 words, soft, precise, cutting through the room like truth. The sound froze the Sands Hotel to its bones, and the entire room went silent. For a long moment no one moved. Elvis's final line hung in the air like a slow falling feather. It didn't sting. It didn't brag. It simply told the truth in a way that didn't need volume. The Sands Hotel, usually loud and reckless after dark, suddenly felt like a church where everyone had forgotten how to breathe. Dean Martin lowered his glass slowly, carefully, almost respectfully. Elvis didn't smile. He didn't bow. He didn't look proud. He just stepped back a single pace, letting the last echo of the piano fade into the thick smoke drifting above the tables. Eddie, the pianist, froze with his hands hovering an inch above the keys. He didn't dare play another note. He knew the moment was too fragile to touch. A showgirl standing near the back wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before anyone could see. She had watched Elvis perform before, but she had never seen him like this. Bare, honest, and completely unguarded. A waiter holding a tray of drinks stood perfectly still. He clutched a crumpled ticket stub from Elvis's '62 Vegas show in his back pocket. A little keepsake he carried everywhere. The song brought the memory back. His first time seeing Elvis, the thrill of the lights, the feeling that something big was happening on stage. Now he felt that again. Sammy Davis Jr. whispered, "Man, he didn't just sing it, he lived it." Frank Sinatra nodded slowly, eyes locked on Elvis. There was no teasing in. His gaze now only respect, deep, quiet respect. Colonel Parker exhaled for the first time in minutes. He had been terrified Elvis would fold under the pressure. Instead, Elvis had done the opposite. He had taken a moment designed to embarrass him and turned it into something beautiful. The transformation in the room was impossible to miss. Moments earlier, the Rat Pack had been kings watching a newcomer prove himself. Now they watched a man who didn't need to prove anything. A man who had just shown everyone in that dimly lit room what heart looked like. Millie Kirkland held her breath, hands pressed to her chest. She whispered, "This is who he really is." And she was right. For a few minutes, Elvis wasn't the superstar with screaming fans. He wasn't the king on magazine covers. He was just a man singing truth into a crowded room. Truth with a soft gospel bend that made people feel something deep inside. The final note disappeared into silence. Then Dean Martin stood. All eyes turned to him. His movements were slow, like he was walking through water. He didn't crack a joke. He didn't flash a smirk. He didn't deflect with charm. He just stared at Elvis, searching his face for something. An explanation, a hint, a sign that Elvis understood the weight of what he had done. Elvis stood calm, quiet, steady. Dean sat down his drink. He took one careful step, then another. He walked toward Elvis slowly, his expression unreadable. The room frozen around him. People leaned forward in their seats. Someone whispered, "What's he going to do?" Dean Martin stood inches from Elvis, close enough for the smoke from his own cigarette to curl between them. The room didn't blink. Even the lights seemed to dim, as if Vegas itself wanted to hear what Dean would say. Elvis stayed completely still, his breathing soft and steady, his eyes level and open. Dean finally spoke quietly, almost gently. "You're the real deal, kid." The words weren't loud, but they hit harder than any joke or challenge he'd thrown earlier. They weren't flattery. They weren't charity. They were truth, pure and simple. Truth that came from a man who had seen thousands of performers come and go. Frank Sinatra nodded once, firm and approving. Sammy Davis Jr. clapped a single loud clap that echoed like a spark jumping across wires. The tension in the room softened into a warmth that felt rare in show business. Respect. Real respect, not the stage kind. Elvis nodded slightly, accepting the moment without claiming it. Humility suited him more than any spotlight. In that small private room, barely 40 people, dim lights, cigarette haze, something shifted. The Rat Pack no longer looked at him as the young rocker kid who exploded out of the South. They saw a peer, a craftsman, a man who understood the soul of music in a way that couldn't be faked. In the years that followed, the story of that night slipped quietly into the shadows of Vegas history. No newspapers wrote about it. No crowds witnessed it, but word traveled backstage, whispered by performers, shared by bartenders, carried by showgirls who had seen more truth in dim rooms than tourists ever would. One rumor lasted longer than the rest. A Copa Room technician claimed he had recorded the entire moment on a bootleg reel tour tape. He said he didn't mean to. He'd been testing equipment in the back when the tension rose. But when he heard Dean challenge Elvis, he let the reel run. The tape, he said, captured the silence after Elvis's final line. The kind of silence that doesn't belong to fear. The kind that belongs to awe. Whether the tape truly existed, no one ever proved. But the rumor alone added fuel to the legend. Fuel that still flickers in old Vegas fan circles today. Years later, long after the Sands Hotel was remodeled and the old Copa Room walls were replaced, someone installed a small plaque inside the tribute hall. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't framed in gold. It was simple metal, polished smooth with a single line engraved across it. He silenced the room by telling the truth. People walked past it every day without knowing the story. But the ones who did, the ones who lived that night, felt a tug in their chest every time they saw it because they remembered. They remembered Elvis not as the king, not as the superstar, not as the icon, but as the man who sang another man's song and made the whole room believe in him. And yet, one last detail from that night stayed hidden for decades. A detail no one dared mention. A detail that would change the meaning of everything. The final detail from that night didn't come from Dean or Frank or even Colonel Parker. It surfaced years later in a dusty storage box pulled from a retired showgirl's apartment. Inside was a faded diary belonging to Angela Rios, a dancer who had been standing near the back of the Copa Room that night. Her handwriting was neat but hurried, like she was trying to capture the moment before it slipped away. On the page marked July 18, 1963, she wrote something no one else had ever said out loud. Elvis didn't beat Dean. He didn't try to. He showed him the kind of heart no stage lights can fake. Angela described how Dean's challenge wasn't about singing. It was about pride, about proving who belonged in the room. But Elvis had answered differently. Not with aggression, not with ego. He answered with soul, with sincerity, with something even the Rat Pack couldn't manufacture. She wrote, Dean walked toward him like a man approaching the truth, and Elvis stood there like someone who wasn't scared of it. Her diary captured tiny details no one remembered. The trembling of the pianist's hands, the bartender stopping mid-polish, the showgirl clinging to her feathered fan because her fingers were shaking. But the part that mattered most came near the bottom of the page. Angela wrote, Everyone thought Dean tested his talent, but he was really testing his confidence. Elvis passed because he didn't need the crown to be the king. That was the hidden detail. The real reason the room went silent wasn't because Elvis sang better. It was because Elvis sang honestly. He didn't imitate Dean. He didn't compete. He didn't push. He simply stepped into the song with the same heart he used on stage in front of thousands. Authenticity was his comeback. And authenticity was why Dean finally understood who Elvis really was. Have you ever seen someone win without raising their voice? And did it change the way you saw strength? Years later, that quiet diary page helped historians understand why the small plaque in the Sands Tribute Hall read what it did. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about rivalry. It was about truth, something rare even among legends. Angela ended her entry with one final line written softly, as if she didn't want to disturb the memory. When he finished singing, I didn't see two stars anymore. I saw two men, and one of them had just told the truth in the most beautiful way possible. Elvis didn't win by overpowering the room. He won by being real. And that was the part the world never got to see until someone finally opened a forgotten diary and let the truth breathe again. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes music reveals a person's true heart. Legends aren't remembered for their crowns, but for the moments they dared to be honest. And if you or someone you know ever saw Elvis in person, tell us that memory.